Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 29th of December. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And we can say that today was the most massive missile strike on the territory of Ukraine since October, since the beginning of massive missile strikes in Ukraine that we saw since the beginning of the special operation. During the day, the Russians attacked almost every single town in Ukraine. As you can see, a lot of town on the western part of Ukraine was under fire. A lot of places were attacked by the Russians in Kiev itself. A lot of attacks the Russians were attacked Kharkiv and many other towns. A lot of attacks was in Nikolaev and Odessa region. A lot of towns, a lot of territory of Ukraine was completely cut off from electricity, from water support, and so on. So that was the most massive attack. But of course, this is important, and as we discussed a few days ago, I told you that we should expect some attack, and I expected this attack. Yesterday, the Russians attacked the towns on the front lines like Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Kharkiv, but yesterday the Russians were attacking the military objects on the territory of Ukraine on the front line. If we're talking about today, the Russians attack energy facilities and military objects, military industrial plants, and so on. And to tell the truth, I don't know about the real results that the Russians managed to achieve, but I believe that the next day we are going to receive some updates. But not just these attacks were very interesting. Today we have a lot of interesting updates that connected with these attacks. And the first is that during this attack, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack the Russian airport near Saratov. It's Engels Airport. We discussed this airport many times. This is the airport that the Russians uses for their strategic bombardments. Mainly the Russians attack Ukraine using this airport. So the distance between this airport and let's say Kharkiv district is around 700 kilometers. And so that the Ukrainians do have possibilities to send mainly drones to attack this area. And during the previous weeks, months, the Ukrainians made at least two effective attacks. As a result of those attacks, according to the Western sources, the Russians lost something around 5 or 7 soldiers, and also a few airplanes, air carriers were damaged during those attacks. If we're talking about today, the Russians reported that they managed to spot drones and attack them and shut down. This is another important thing about this missiling that the Russians did during the day. Another important thing that I mentioned today during the day, that some Russian military channels and Ukrainian channels and the Western channels reported that during the day a lot of rockets from the Russian side were shut down by the Russians themselves. Of course, we can say that it was some kind of speculation from the Ukrainian side or something like this. But I believe that the Ukrainians decided to change their tactic, and to tell the truth, they're very smart if they are able to do this. First of all, while the Russians attack the Ukrainians from their side tries to attack the Russians. And as far as I understand, the Russians' air defense systems sometimes can't understand which rockets or drones are flying in their direction. So at the time when the Russians attack the Ukrainians with missiles and drones, at the same time the Ukrainians send their own drones, and the Russian air defense system became crazy. Because from one side, the Russian system see their own rockets, but from the other side, they start seeing the Ukrainian drones or rockets or something like this. And this situation leads to the facts that the Russians during the day shut down maybe one, maybe more rockets, their own rockets. So as you can see, this is a very interesting situation, and I believe that furthermore, this attack over the Russian strategic aircraft, this area, we saw this attack during the same period. The Russians attacked the Ukrainians with missiles. At the same time, the Russians sent their own drones. So they decided to use this attack as some kind of shield. as some kind of protection, because during, as I understand, as I see, during these attacks, the Russians can't understand and they can't see the real picture on the ground, and or not on the ground but in the air. Of course, I believe that sooner or later they will find a solution how to solve these issues. Maybe it will take months or even more. I don't know how the Ukrainians are able to use this situation. But anyway, this is what I mentioned today during the day, that Ukrainians attack at the same time, and they uses the Russian attacks as some kind of protection and shield from the Russian air defense system. Very smart, I believe. Now let's move to the situation on the ground. Today we got another important updates from many front lines. The most important comes from Bakhmut, but let's start from the north, from Kupiansk-Liman front line. Let's discuss the numbers. And the Russians reported that during the day the Ukraine lost just 20 soldiers, something around 5 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the losses are not big. So we can say that the activity on the front line, this front line, is not so high as activity, let's say, on Liman or Donetsk front line and so on. During the artillery duels, the Russians managed to destroy Ukrainian M777 artillery system in Kruglyakivka, according to the report of Ministry of Defense. So the Russians continue doing some kind of effective artillery duels, and as we see, the north, the Kupiansk front line, has been completely freezed by the Russians, and the Ukrainians are not able to do anything in this front line. Now we are moving to Liman, and today the Russians reported that during the day the Ukrainians lost around 70 soldiers and something around 8 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the number of losses on this front line is much higher than on the Kupiansk, and we discussed many times Kremenaya. The Ukrainians attacked Kremenaya from many sides, as we discussed yesterday, from the north, from the west, and from the south. The Russians during the day were trying to stop and pin down the Ukrainians. They attack the main base, or the main center that there are at least two centers that Ukrainians uses to coordinate the offensive operation in direction of Kremenaya. I'm talking about Seversk and Liman, and today the Russians tried to pin down Ukrainian forces in Seversk. Were trying to freeze their activity, their job. They attacked this area with artillery, with rockets and so on, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost one ammo depot in Seversk. The Ukrainian lost one artillery system, one howitzer, Stab B. Furthermore, the Russians attacked Serebryanka, this forest. The Russians were attacking the Ukrainian commandos who were trying to cross the forest in direction of Dubrovo and Kremenaya itself. The Russians are saying that 95th Brigade, let's return to the deployment map. I'm not sure that this 95th Brigade is located in this area. There is 54th. The Russians were attacking 95th Brigade, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians in Serebryanka, this small town that located on along the Seversky Donetsk River, the Ukrainians lost around 70 soldiers and something around 8 armored vehicles. But anyway, the Ukrainians continue pushing in direction of Kremenaya, and if we are talking about the front lines, they continue accumulating forces, and I believe that maybe even, I'm not sure that about this year, but maybe at the beginning of the next year, or maybe somewhere by the end of January or in the middle part, the Ukrainians will do another attempt of storming Kremenaya if they are able, let's say, to stabilize the front line around Bakhmut and around Yakovlivka, around Razdolovka, and so on. Now we are moving to Bakhmut, and first would like to say that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians reported that Ukrainians lost on Donetsk front line. And how I'm talking about Donetsk, it's the area between Avdiivka and, let's say, Bakhmut. The Ukraine lost about 80 soldiers and something around 13 armored vehicles, and these numbers don't include the Ukrainian losses from Wagner's group fire, so I can't tell the real numbers on Bakhmut. I believe that they're much more higher. But anyway, as you can see, there are two important icons in Bakhmut. The first one is on the north east. There's like an icon by the name of promotion, and another one on the south, on the north of Klishevka, another icon with the Russian title, but these icons mean the same. It's another promotion on the south. So let's return to the Western Sources map just to update this map for you, for better understanding of the situation that the Russians reported they managed to achieve during the previous 24 hours. Let's start from the north one, from the area near Podgorodne, this one. As you can see, the Russians managed to establish control over the territory that located over this territory, let's say. So something like this. Yes, it's a progress, of course. It's very important to increase the pressure and to push the Ukrainians from this side of Bakhmut. But anyway, there is another important barrier in front of the Russians. It's the river Bakhmut that moves in the middle part of town. So anyway, there are still a lot of job to do. And now let's discuss more interesting piece of update. I'm talking about the south one. So according to this information, if we return back to this map, according to this information, the Russians established control over this part of Bakhmut. And as you can see, this one, as you can see, the Russians managed to get control over part of Bakhmut that located on, let's say, on the west side of Bakhmut River. So this is very important. To tell the truth, I'm not sure how the Russians are going to hold these territories, how are they going to hold this bridgehead, because there are no strict safe road or strict road with this area that the Russians are able to use to move armored vehicles and tanks. It's a city battle, the battle in town, and anyway you need to have some armor in this town. You can't hold the suburbs or the edge of this town without armored vehicles, without tank support. And if we see, Oputna remains under Ukrainian control, so the only way to get there is using fields and to cross, even though you need to cross the river. So using these fields, the Russians can send armored vehicles, tanks, and of course all these roads are under artillery control from the Ukrainian side. Anyway, these guys, if they are able to hold this part of Bakhmut, will be heroes. And of course, if they are able to hold these positions to establish bridgehead, we can start counting days before entire Bakhmut is going to fall. Because this is, if it's true, if the Russians entered this part of Bakhmut and established real bridgehead, believe me, this is the beginning of Bakhmut fell. Because I can't even imagine how the Ukrainians were able to give such opportunity for the Russians to get control over this territory without taking Klishevka. I'm not talking about even Klishevka, because by taking this road we understand that there are no more connections between Klishevka and Bakhmut. There are just fields that moves from the northwest part of Bakhmut to Ivanovska. All these roads is under fire control and the weather is not so good to use anything to supply and support this town. So I believe that these days the Russians will be able to take control over Klishevka as well, and this is going to be a completely different story for Bakhmut, because this small corner is the focal corner for the Ukrainians. It's the most valuable part of Bakhmut that the Russians managed to get control over. And the thing is that there are a river Bakhmut and there are bridges, but all these bridges are mined by the Ukrainians or destroyed by the Ukrainians. And even if the Russians are able to push the Ukrainians from this side of Bakhmut on this side of Bakhmut, anyway they still need find a solution how to get on this side, on the west side of Bakhmut. And even before pushing Ukrainians from the eastern part of Bakhmut, they managed to get one of the most valuable part of Bakhmut, and they entered there, according to the Russian sources, of course. But furthermore, if we take a look at the Institute of Study of War map, this map shows the same picture. So this is our Bakhmut, and this is the corner I'm talking about. This territory has the color of yellow, and that means that the Institute of Study of War updated this map according to the information they found in internet in the open source. But anyway, as we see, this information at least have some value, or the resources who provide this information have some value for this institute. So anyway, I believe that we need to pay attention and to follow these updates as well. And the Russians are saying that during the previous days, you know that Ukrainians sends a lot of forces on the edge, on the zero line, and there are very heavy clashes, and the losses from the Ukrainian side are very high, and all these things force the Ukrainians to make rotation very often. The Ukrainians do rotation almost every single few days. Now, 5 days left, they need to make rotation. Another 5 days, they need to make another rotation. They take the forces on the zero line, they send them back, and they bring more fresh and new forces. And of course, all this situation forced the Ukrainians, the soldiers, not to trust their commanders. They understand that they are sent on to some suicide areas, to some mid-grinder, and of course they are not motivated to fight. They don't have spirit at all. The only thing they want is just to escape or evacuate from this area. And something like this took place near Yakovlivka and Solidar. And today, during the day, the Russians reported, and yesterday and today, that they were attacking from Yakovlivka in direction of Solidar. Let's return back to this map. The Russians were attacking in this area, something like this, according to this arrow. And from the Ukrainian side, the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade was located between Yakovlivka and Solidar. They were controlling around 4 or 5 checkpoints in these fields, in this forest. They were completely new, fresh forces who were moved to this area, and as soon as the Russians started artillery attack, artillery preparation, according to the Russian sources, these forces who were controlling these checkpoints just raced and ran away where their eyes were seeing. So they just left their positions, and this is the reason why the Russians were so successful on the north of Solidar. And I won't be surprised if something like that took place in the south of Bakhmut. Completely new fresh forces were deployed in this part. The Russians started their massive heavy artillery attack, and these guys just decided to step back and to run away from these positions, and that allowed the Russians to be so easily, because I'm very surprised if the Russians got control over the south of Bakhmut, and I will be completely surprised if they are able to not just to hold this position, but to develop the bridgehead in this area as well. This is completely different picture from now on, completely different picture, because just let's discuss Opotne. The Russians are trying to storm Opotne maybe for months. Maybe a month have already passed since the period of time when the Russians started storming Opotne. The Russians control Ivangrad, the Russians now control this part of Bakhmut. That means that Ukrainian forces in Opotne are encircled. This is cauldron. This is a real cauldron, and I believe that maybe these days we're going to receive some updates, because I'm sure that the Russians from this bridgehead will try to push Ukrainians to attack, not to give them any opportunities to be flexible, and I believe that they might encircle Opotne, and the Opotne front line is going to collapse. If this front line is not going to collapse today, I believe that by the 1st or the 2nd of January, this front line will be collapsed, or the Ukrainians in this area will be encircled, and they will be burned in this cauldron. So, and this means that entire collapse of the south of Bakhmut, and from that moment, I can't even understand where the Ukrainians will try to prepare another defense line in Bakhmut, because from this moment, maybe of course they will try to build their defense line along the railroad rockade, but this is the reason why the Russians stormed Klishchevka, and if the Russians controls entire Bakhmut on the east side of this railroad, of course from this moment the Russians will be able to attack along this forest and to take control over the west part from this railroad rockade. So everything is complicated, but anyway, this small bridgehead on the south of Bakhmut is a very big step before the Russians takes the entire control of Bakhmut. Now let's move to Donetsk, and if we are talking about Donetsk, the situation, we can't say that the situation is good, because Donetsk is under fire, but Donetsk is much less under fire than it used to be weeks ago, when we discussed that during the week or two there were around 80 killed and something around 200 wounded. when the Ukrainians were attacking the central part. As a result of active artillery duels, effective artillery duels, the Russians managed to reduce the Ukrainian artillery systems. And if we're talking about these days, the Russians, as far as I remember, managed to shut down, destroy a few artillery systems in this area, at least in Orekhov. The Russians report about destroying of the D-30 howitzer, and I believe maybe that's it. There are no more artillery systems that the Russians managed to destroy near Donetsk. Some one HIMARS system was destroyed, by the way, near Konstantinovka. This is also very good update for the Russians. Another artillery system, Stab B, was destroyed in Seversk. Two M77s were destroyed in Kupiansk front line. So as you can see, pretty successful and effective artillery duels there for the Russian side. If we're talking about Marinka, no progress. There are still heavy clashes. The Russians promised us that they will take Marinka by the end of this year, but as we can see, there are still a lot of blocks, a lot of streets they need to clear. So I'm not sure, and I'm sure that the Russians are not able to establish control over Marinka by the end of this year. There was some kind of activation from the Ukrainian side near Velika Novoselovka. They were attacking the Russians on the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. As the Russian military experts are saying that it's just another attempt from the Ukrainian side to develop their positions and just to get better fire positions in this area. Nothing important from this part of the front line. If we're talking about South Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians reported that as a result, the Russians reported that as a result of the clashes, the Ukraine lost around 30 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. So as you can see, there are no active clashes as well. And of course, if you're talking about this front line, Marinka is the most important part, because everybody are saying that, military experts are saying that if the Russians are not able to take Marinka, in this case, they will be forced to storm Ugledar in front. And of course, this situation will bring to many losses from the Russian side. So this is the reason why the Russians need to take Marinka, and then they will be able to attack Ugledar from the back. But for now, there are no progress on this front line. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.